Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from Constructing Excellence, the joint webinar that we're running again with Oxford and the Cambridge-Oxford Corridor Group. I'll just give you a few seconds to join. I can see lots of people coming into the room as I'm talking. So while everyone's joining, I'll just do a very brief introduction for today's speakers. So we're very grateful to have Savills with us today. So it's been 3 years since the Partnering for Prosperity reports and first real talk about the Cambridge-Oxford corridor, or ARC, or whatever you want to call it, sort of started to kick off. Savills have obviously been involved from very early doors. Lots of talk has been around the 2 million people or 1 million homes and millions of jobs. But I want to find out, if we can today, where are we now? And David and Jonathan are hopefully going to help us to find that out. So we've got David Bainbridge, who's Planning Director at Savills. He's got over 22 years of experience in consultancy and local government. His particular expertise is in the field of planning advice for residential and mixed use developments. And then we also have with him Jonathan Dixon, who, similar to David, is a director at Savills. His background's in architecture with over 20 years experience in the field across the UK. He also acts as an expert witness in planning inquiries and leads Savills' National Housing Need and Supply team. So I'm going to hand over to David and Jonathan now and let them do the talking. As I say, thank you again very much for joining us. If you've got any comments, do put them in the chat box. If you've got any Q&A, there is a Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. Do put your questions in there and we'll take those at the end. And without further ado, I shall get the slides up on the screen and we shall hand over to David and Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Stuart, thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for joining us today. Very grateful for your attendance in this webinar, and just extend thanks from myself and Jonathan to the Constructing Excellence Clubs for hosting this event. As you would imagine, as two planning directors who bookend the Oxford-Cambridge ARC, we're very excited about this initiative. We have been for a few years now and will continue to be so excited about what we can deliver between the two big university towns and everything in between those. We think this event is especially timely because we've got the potential round the corner of a new planning white paper, of which there's been a few headlines which has come out. A lot of debate continues on in terms of the planning for sustainable development and how we as planners and built environment professionals can go about adapting to what is currently the new normal, as it were, and what normal might look like going forward. And in particular, working with relevant local authorities and their partners, who I must say have adapted well to what took place later on in March to continue a number of their functions, their planning functions and determinations of applications in particular. So it's an exciting time. First slide, if I may, please, Stuart. You'll see here, obviously, Jonathan and I, in younger days, I should say, but nonetheless, I won't read out all the blurb there because Stuart has very kindly introduced us. But as I say, Jonathan and I bookend the growth arc, and as it happens, we've both been happily involved in the art and science of town and country planning since 1998, as it happens. So next slide, please, that'd be great. Thank you. Coming up is the agenda. Obviously, this is a relatively brief webinar, so there's only so much detail we can go into, but we certainly wanted to break up what we're presenting from where we're at, so setting the context, the background, and then taking it forward in terms of not just where we're at, but where we are going to, which is so relevant. And obviously, Jonathan and I engaging on a week-to-week basis with clients, with local authorities and wider partners, to see where growth options can come forward, whether it's small scale, medium scale, larger scale, housing, mixed use, whatever that might be. We move on to the next one. So this is where we're at, and the next slide, which will be an image, which some will be familiar with, of an extract from the report, The Government Ambition and Joint Declaration Between Government and Local Partners. Bit of a mouthful, but this was March 2019. Now, just focus upon this image for the time being. The geographical area, although not defined this precisely, was, as Stuart had said in the introduction, first mention became a thing 4 years ago, because the National Infrastructure Commission was commissioned in March 2016 to undertake some research and to report through to government to maximise the potential of what they were calling then the Cambridge, Milton Keynes, Oxford corridor as a single knowledge-intensive cluster that would compete on a global stage, high ambition to protect the area's high-quality environment and securing the homes and jobs that the area needs. So at that point in time, 4 years ago, March 2016, as Stuart said, we had an interim report in November 2016, and we are Partnering for Prosperity in November 2017. Since then, I think what's particularly relevant is to note that the ARC has been mentioned in the budget statement in 2018. It was mentioned within the spring statement in March 2019, and it was mentioned in the budget in March of this year. So this area here, it doesn't necessarily cover the full geographical extent, but what this is looking to do from the report from March of last year, which I should say, for those not familiar, had the backing of 4 government departments. I don't think that's necessarily unprecedented, but it is a significant consideration that we had within this report: the Treasury, we had environment, we had housing, and we had transport departments coming together to lay down its ambition for this initiative. And not just its ambition, but there is a part which is the joint ambition with local authorities. Now, many will be familiar that you've got the 5 ceremonial counties, which are shown on the screen here: Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, with, of course, Bedfordshire and Buckinghamshire being unitary authorities. Now, there are areas beyond the counties which are shown on this image, which will, of course, benefit and influence what this initiative is about, not least through reduction within travel to work areas. You know, whether a person lives within North Hertfordshire, travels into the archetype area, or they're in South Warwickshire, or indeed North Berkshire, those sort of areas nearby, including on the eastern side, they will influence and benefit from this area. But it's interesting that, you know, just this image from March of last year, how things have changed a bit. You'll see that you've got the old authorities within Buckinghamshire, which of course are now unitary. So the next slide, hopefully, is interesting and familiar to some. Really, these again are extracts taken from that same report. I don't propose to read all the text which is on the screen there. Some of the facts and figures are, I don't know whether we can go back one step, Stuart, if that's okay, but some of the facts and figures there are particularly relevant, not least in terms of the fact that you've got a population, thank you, Stuart, you've got a population which is over 3 million. You've also got, over £100 billion worth each year, which is in gross added value towards the exchequer. And the ministerial forward for the report says about the long-term economic ambition, which includes up to 1 million high-quality new homes by 2050. And crucially as well, let's not forget that you've got commitment to natural capital. So that was the government ambition, specific reference, 1 million high-quality new homes. Now, I don't want to make too much of it, but it's interesting in that within that document from March of last year, you've got a written declaration of ambition between the government and between the local partners. In that written ambition, there is no mention of the 1 million homes figure. Again, don't want to read too much into it, but I think it's particularly relevant because one of the considerations is, what is the 1 million new homes? What does it look like? Is it a target? Is it just an ambition? And how well held is it, perhaps, at the local centre? Now, this is Jonathan's particular area, which Jonathan will speak to us, so I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, David. So looking at housing requirements across the ARC, we've got 25 different local authorities, and across those there are considerable differences, not just in geography, but in the levels of growth, varying from a few hundred homes a year to several thousand. Current delivery is running at around 20,000 homes a year. It's creeping up gradually over the last few years, but that's on a par with pretty much what is required. So we're all doing fairly well. If you recalculate the housing requirement across the ARC using the current standard method for calculating local housing need, you get to a very similar figure of about 20,000 homes a year. But there are some differences between authorities, with some having their requirement increase and some having their requirement decrease. Later this year, we're likely to get standard method version 2. That will be different, and in all likelihood, it will include an element calculated on the basis of stock. Although that methodology has yet to be confirmed, it's likely to result in yet again a figure of about 20,000 homes for the authorities within the ARC. But again, there's likely to be some very big differences for individual local planning authorities. And I say that because the new method is likely to have some continued reference to the household populations, which we're due the latest iteration of later this month, which, if they're used, will result in some authorities having sizable increases, but some authorities having sizable decreases. So, if we do some maths based on the 1 million new homes a year over the 2020 to 2050 period, we get to a figure of just over 30,000 homes a year. The delivery of that 30,000 homes a year will need some very serious joined up planning and some significant levels of agreement between the various authorities and other stakeholders. Stuart, can we move on to the next slide, please?
Thank you. So this really is where we are going to, and I must admit I've looked at some of the comments that some of the participants have put up, and thank you very much for those. One in particular, dare I say, leading council has already preempted some of the slides that we've got coming up, so thank you for that. But also there's a comment which I should have mentioned in terms of Northamptonshire, of course, which will become 2 unitary authorities in April of next year. So thank you for the participant who made that particular comment. Right, so in terms of where we're going to, we've got on the screen here, which will be familiar to many, no doubt, the East-West Rail, the preferred route, which I believe was announced towards the end of January this year. Now, this image you'll see takes in from the west of Cambridge through to the west of Bedford. And you have within the light green area, hopefully that's clear, sufficiently clear where you're participating from. The light green area is the preferred route option area for where the new rail line will go, obviously connecting Bedford through to Cambridge. Now, it's interesting that obviously the width of that light green area varies, but bear in mind that we've got existing stations, Cambridge, Bedford, and we've got proposed stations as well. So you'll see there in terms of the blue boxes with white text, that you've got the potential for a new station at St Neots Sandy area, Camborne, also you've got Cambridge South, which is identified. But looking at St Neots Sandy area, that's quite a wide light green area, you know, to the south of Boston, near to St Neots, and to the north of Sandy. Then when you come to Camborne and the strategic growth that's taking place there, you will see obviously that's a narrower area for where there might be a new train station at Camborne. So you think that perhaps obviously they've narrowed down the area. And then when you get to the south of Cambridge end, again you've got a very wide area of land which is taken in terms of that route option. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. This route option, some will know, was route E, I believe, from the consultation of last year. It was one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive estimate. Obviously, going forward, the announcement was that this was thought to give the best value for taxpayers, this particular route option. The process I understand is going to be a development consent order process. So this is not a planning permission granted at the local level for the infrastructure. And I understand that there's still the aspiration to have that line open by 2030. Of course, the intention would be to have the connection within the central part and the western part, such that you'll have a rail connectivity between Oxford and Cambridge, and obviously via to the south of Milton Keynes at Bletchley, which connects in with the West Coast Main Line, via Bedford, and also a connection on the East Coast Main Line, which is that broad light green area at St Neots area. So Now, final thing to say while we're on this slide is that we don't have a slide regarding the expressway road, sometimes called the Oxford to MK Expressway. That's deliberate. And the reason being is that many who are participating will, of course, be aware that as a result of the budget in March of this year, Highways England have paused further development into the project. They, with government, are exploring improvements and looking to engage in respect of what's referred to as a new spatial plan that is to come forward. And we'll touch more upon the new spatial plan shortly, but if I now may hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Stuart. One of the problems that we currently have across the Arc is that there's very little synergy between the different local plans. It's due in part due to the lack of coordination, or in other places due to outright hostility between some of those local authorities. Politics plays a part. We've got a target period, as I've taken to calling it, of 2020 to 2050. With some of those plans already covering part of that time period, we'll need those existing plans to be revisited if the full potential of the Arc is to be delivered, and especially if the increased levels of growth are to be delivered. Infrastructure and viability will be key to that, as we've seen with the garden communities in North Essex, both in Uttlesford and across the North Essex authorities. Those garden communities must be viable and must be robust if they are to be deliverable. To provide some context, an extra 10,000 dwellings per annum, as I discussed earlier, is equivalent to 40 new garden communities across the Arc. All of this clearly takes time, and yet the focus with the local authorities at the moment seems in large part remaining on the short term. Looking at the impact of the current coronavirus crisis, which I think we'll all accept is going to be around for a while, I would suggest that this is taught or is currently teaching us three things. The first is that things change. The only good plan, and that includes local plans, is a flexible plan. Too many plans are written in the context of today, whilst they look forward 15 or 20 years, and don't properly take into account what will change over that next 15 to 20 years. We would always suggest that in doing that, a local authority looks back 15 or 20 years to see how much has changed over that period. The second and third things that COVID crisis has taught us is that we need to deal with the present whilst at the same time looking to the longer term. The two can't be done in series, they have to be done in parallel. David, I'll pass back to you at that point.
Thank you very much. Marvellous. Right, this next slide hopefully is not particularly controversial. This is what we just call hotspots. Now, hotspots really, as we're presenting it, is more about strategic scale development, strategic term also. So this is really drawn upon a number of different sources, and I'm sure it won't be a surprise to many participants why we selected these locations. So just taking it in turn here, the M40 corridor, Oxfordshire, and that's particularly because of the connectivity between Oxford and Milton Keynes and everything that's in between there. Of course, Milton quite well known about in the public domain, depending where you choose to focus your attention. And then looking at Milton Keynes, north and south. Recently, of course, it's had the fact that north and south growth options, and that's been the MK 2050 consultation which has taken place. No doubt there's many discussions taking place with surrounding authorities, Northamptonshire, what is now of course the Buckinghamshire Authority, and Central Bedfordshire Authority. Bedford Town, now this has always been a growth location, as some of the other locations have been, a number of sustainable urban extensions and what have you, a local plan to 2030, which then obviously needs to be brought forward with additional growth requirements and locations. And an important aspect of Bedford Town is, of course, the fact that we'll have the new East-West Rail potentially coming out to the north of the town. And of course, there will be at least one strategic scale location for growth, one would think, that the local authority would take forward there. A1 corridor, Bedfordshire. Now, we mention this because, of course, it's close to the A1 line. It has the crossover of the east-west rail in terms of the preferred route option, and it's quite a wide area which needs to be narrowed down. Arguably, the current plan, in particular central Bedfordshire, leaves some of the growth and spatial options for another day to come forward. So we see that as an area of focus. And of course, Camborne, potential with the new train station, and Cambridge with the Cambridge South connection. I mean, these shouldn't be surprises to anyone. I think, the government specifically said within that budget announcement that the government intends to build a new train station at Cambridge South and explore the case. Now, as I say, these shouldn't be controversial, but there are the growth arc where one could see strategic scale development coming forward. If you think of the south of Northamptonshire, I don't just mean the district, but the south of Northamptonshire and parts of the north of Northamptonshire as well, it's inevitable, given the connectivity between that county as it currently stands and the wider arc, that there could be strategic scale development which comes forward specifically to achieve the numbers, some of which Jonathan has mentioned. Next slide. Excuse me. So delivery. And I mentioned about the budget announcement in March of this year. I'm not sure why that skipped on, unfortunately, but Section 2, thank you. Section 2, budget policy decisions within the budget is an interesting read. Some may have had a look at that. And really what it says is that the government with local partners will develop a long-term spatial framework, that's the first bullet point, to support strategic planning to the year 2050. Now, within there, they make reference to the creation of up to 4 new development corporations. I don't think these will be a surprise to many who are watching this. There is links, of course, to existing and new train stations. And of course, development corporations, but whatever one thinks of those, and there's been various different formats and different locations, they can bring with them impetus, funding. A development corporation is able, of course, to acquire land through negotiation, to acquire land through compulsory purchase order. A development corporation is able to grant planning permissions, so have decision-making powers. It's arguably debatable as to the ability of development corporations to bring forward developments quicker than otherwise would be the case. And to my knowledge, in any event, I've not seen a development corporation that's had plan-making powers. So one would perhaps say that there needs to be that further level of engagement, working with partners, which clearly, there is an ARC leaders group, which is led by the leader of Cherwell District. There is England's Economic Heartland, which many will be familiar with, which also has a number of meetings and initiatives which it runs forward. But really there needs to be the connection between whether there are going to be 4 development corporations and what might be the long-term strategic plan up to the year 2050. So now moving on to Jonathan, who will cover the slide which is on the screen regarding housing land supply.
Thank you, David. I'm not quite sure what's up with the slides there. It seems to have an inherent interest in housing land supply.
Sorry about that. There seemed to be an animation on that last slide, so it just kept moving. I couldn't stop it. So.
Just picking up on the questions very briefly before we move on to more numbers, because I know that it's been discussed, but there was a question that I saw come in relation to it's not just all about numbers. And it isn't all about numbers, but the last 2 points on the previous slide were also about ensuring there's sufficient funding for scheme viability and the need to develop, balance delivery and sustainability. And clearly, it's not just all about numbers. However, what it is about is delivering sustainable, well-designed places. And if a development is not deliverable, then you won't get the houses, you won't get the numbers, but equally you won't get the well-designed places. And as we saw with the North Essex Authorities Inspector, what he was extremely concerned about was that those garden communities are deliverable in a viable fashion. What he was concerned about was that not only would you get the houses, but that you would get the infrastructure and what some might call all the goodies that go with delivering the numbers. So if we then turn to look at housing land supply across the arc, it's generally not that robust. And I say that in reference to the fact that most authorities are below 6 years supply. That's reflected in the fact that it is subject to continual challenge, more so in some authorities, less so in others. But generally, there is synergy between those authorities that have a good 5-year housing land supply and those authorities that deliver homes, as evidenced through the housing delivery test. If we look at the impact of the coronavirus crisis again, there is going to be a short-term hit in terms of the number of homes delivered this year, and probably for the next 2 years or so. There will then be long-term implications, and those will be very, very different. Those will be resulting from the wider economic impact. However, looking at the numerical aspect of the impact, even if we have a 25% reduction in delivery this year, a 15% delivery reduction next year, and a 10% the year after that, all of that adds up for a 5-year housing land supply to only about half a year worth of delivery. Whilst it doesn't sound like very much, it could cause difficulties for quite a few local authorities in the arc where their supply is only at around 5.5 years, and is certainly likely to increase the risk of speculative challenge. In terms of the housing delivery test, the results we're going to get later this year could increase the triggering of the presumption in favour in quite a few authorities. But actually, there's only a few within the arc that are likely to be affected. There are arguments about the applicability of those penalties stemming from the 5-year land supply and the housing delivery test, given the current crisis. However, the housing delivery test measured supply up until, or delivery up until the end of March this year, so it's very unlikely to have been very affected. And as we've seen, even though you might get a fairly significant impact on the housing land supply, it might only knock half a year or so off. So those authorities that have got a robust supply should not be too worried. David, back to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, we should have our final slide, which should be the conclusion slide. Marvellous. Just some simple bullet points there. And what this will do is move us on nicely to questions and answers, although clearly the presentation is the mind of the tongue. But anyway, what we're looking to say in terms of that last slide is that we'll cover the background and the context. It's clear that the government, through the budget of this year and also reference within planning for the future, it's clear the government has kept its ambition for the arc, that it wants to work with local partners to realise the growth. But I don't think we can escape from the fact that we've had quite a number of years now, certainly going on 3 years since the main report was published by the NIC. And progress has been quite slow, and there aren't plans at the local level, so local plans, which specifically none that I've seen, specifically plan for the scale of development which is required to meet the government ambition. So the bullet points on that slide include partnership, which is an obvious point, working in partnership, including governance, the prospect for potentially 4 development corporations coming into being. We need some impetus. We need the fact that going forward, we've got a framework now whereby there are political leaders and senior officers who are working around different themes and subject matters. I feel we certainly need to open it up to more public consideration, consultation, scrutiny, call it what you may. Funding and delivery and sustainability, which Jonathan has touched upon, is particularly relevant. And what we would like to say in conclusion before Q&A is that we're very aware that this needs to be sustainable development. What we've just gone through in the past few weeks with, however long ahead of us, I think it's well documented that we have enjoyed more of our outdoor green spaces and having access to that as a result of what we've gone through. And there are, of course, 3 pillars to sustainable development, which the government has identified: economic, social, environmental. So whilst often, we talk about housing numbers, we talk about employment, land and jobs, and we talk about hard physical infrastructure, I think none of us should forget about how important natural capital is, about how important social capital is as well to bring forward sustainable development. So think that probably takes us on neatly towards the last part, which is the questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for that presentation, which I hope you all found very useful. I'm sure we will have. I'm pretty sure we've got some more webinars and events coming up in the near future. We're trying to put together as many as we can, so do look out on the various Constructing Excellence group websites for those as they come up. Thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to Jenny and Sally and Sarah and all the other people on the Constructing Excellence Committee, and Jeff and David and everyone who I've forgotten for their help and support in putting this together. And have a good afternoon. Cheers.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.